Hello, viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today, Fantasy Flight Games has published yet another preview article for our upcoming and first Deluxe Expansion, the Great Devourer. The name of this article is Horrific Legions, and, included amongst a surplus of Tyranid spoilers, Fantasy Flight Games has finally decided to unveil the second warlord we've seen of the Tyranid faction, along with its full associated signature squad. Although I'll save my truly in-depth analysis and discussion for the ultimate release of the Great Devourer Deluxe Box Set, I'll nevertheless in this video be providing an overview of this article and our latest round of Tyranid spoilers. But with that said, let's dive right into the second of our Tyranid warlords, the unique unit, the Swarm Lord. He has an attack value of 2, a pool of 6 hit points, as well as the creature and behemoth traits. He has 6 starting resources and a starting hand size of 6, as well as the text reaction. After this warlord commits to a planet, put 1 Termagant token into play at each adjacent planet. So, first and foremost, what really stands out to me about this unit is that, relative to our already unveiled and previously spoiled Tyranid warlord Old One-Eye, the Swarm Lord possesses neither the inherent ability to conjure up enormous amounts of attack power, nor the sheer defensive strength that we happen to have already seen in our alternative Carnifex warlord option. Instead, the strength of the Swarm Lord lies entirely within his ability to potentially generate up to 2 Termagant tokens each and every round of the game, up until the sheer number of planets remaining on the battlefield may potentially prevent you from doing so. So, as long as you can avoid committing him during the command phase to the first planet, so long as there are 3 or more planets in play, each and every turn you can potentially use this reaction to generate you 2 additional token units. And although Termagant tokens are not in and of themselves enormously powerful, they nevertheless count as 1 attack value, 1 hit point token units with the creature and Termagant traits. And, as we've already learned, several Tyranid cards possess hive mind specializations, which all act to confer some sort of special benefit to any Termagant tokens that happen to be present at the same planet as that other unit. So even though these tokens don't start off posing much threat to your opponent, they're exceptionally vulnerable, fragile, squishy, and susceptible to any and all incoming enemy fire, they nevertheless do possess the potential to become formidable attacking token units in their own right. So, certainly while the Swarm Lord itself isn't able to output nearly as much damage as Old One-Eye, you could, through leveraging synergistic card effects, nevertheless ultimately derive much more total attack value through this warlord in conjunction with his tokens, along with any number of other combo-friendly Tyranid army units. Purely taking a look at the Swarm Lord's stats, he's got a perfectly respectable attack value of 2, but that pool of 6 hit points is a little paltry, and even though you're unlikely to be deploying him to the first planet, where you're all but guaranteed to be fighting relatively dangerous battles each and every turn of the game, in a combat situation, he's not tremendously durable, particularly when compared to our other option for Tyranid Warlord, the regenerating Carnifex Old One-Eye. And plus, it's definitely worth considering that although he's able to put a lot of bodies onto the table, those Termagant tokens are exceptionally fragile and susceptible to any number of enemy card effects, ranging from Area Effect 1 to things like Orc Cannon, to a Warp Storm, and certainly something like the Gleeful Plague Beast, without seeing the remaining contents of the Great Devourer Deluxe Expansion, seems like it could be the absolute bane of a Swarmlord player's existence. Perceptive players will certainly note that the Swarmlord's starting hand size and pool of resource tokens are a little low, weighing in at 6, but it's therefore of pinnacle importance to remember that a Tyranid player also begins the game with the Synapse unit of their choice in play. And although previously we've only had the Savage Warrior Prime spoiled, a 0 command icon, 2/5 attacking Synapse unit that has the ability of akin to a warlord, triggering a battle at any planet which it happens to be committed to. In this article, we instead see a new Tyranid Synapse unit, the unique Gravid Turvigon, which itself has 1 command icon, 0 attack value, 4 hit points, and the creature, kraken, and elite traits. And, similar to the Swarmlord, it also has a Termagant token-friendly reaction, in that after this Synapse unit commits to a planet, you put 1 Termagant token into play at that planet. If that planet is infested, you instead put 2 Termagant tokens into play at that planet instead. So, if it just so happens that you're combining the Swarmlord with your Synapse unit of choice being the Gravid Turvigon, while you miss out on the opportunity to trigger as many battles as possible during that round, you nevertheless do benefit from a significantly stronger command presence and, of course, serve to potentially benefit from putting up to 4 1/1 Termagant tokens into play at any number of different potential planets, up to 2 at a hopefully infested planet to which you choose to commit your Gravid Turvigon, and of course 1 token apiece at whichever planets your Swarmlord happens to be commit adjacent to. Over the course of this article, we'll be reviewing several new Tyranid spoiled units that happen to possess that hive mind specialization, which is of paramount importance in transforming these relatively unthreatening and insignificant Termagant tokens into potentially formidable attackers. But without taking any of those cards into consideration, certainly the Gravid Turvigon in and of itself isn't much of a threatening presence on the battlefield, and seeing as how it has no attack value whatsoever, you're certainly going to want to retreat with this unit at the earliest possibility if it just so happens that you're forced into a combat situation. And having only a mere 4 hit points, although it might be relatively durable during the very first few rounds of the game, it nevertheless is going to become a priority target very early for your opponent, and 4 damage certainly is not difficult to accumulate. Even if you happen to hold on to or otherwise save up myriad different shield cards, you could nevertheless fall prey to this Synapse unit being destroyed in something akin to a single swing from your opponent's Iandan Wraithguard, just because a 4 attack value Armorbane attack will very handily destroy the Turvigon, and unless you're oh so fortunate as to have a copy of Fall Back in your hand, with which to return this Synapse unit to play in your HQ, it nevertheless could ultimately prove somewhat disastrous if in the very early game in particular you happen to lose this potentially enormously powerful Synapse unit. Just because if you're running a deck that relies heavily on Termagant token synergy, losing the ability to put anywhere between 1 to 2 additional tokens into play each and every round of the game could be absolutely disastrous. And considering too that not only does this Synapse unit have a significant, albeit single, command icon command phase presence, those tokens can, in turn, derive benefit from additional spoiled Tyranid cards of gaining command icons themselves. So, particularly in the early game, if you're potentially losing that advantage of gaining all the more cards and resources than your opponent, and levering as much economy in your advantage while this unit still remains on the battlefield, then as soon as the odds are stacked against you and this Turvagon ends up destroyed, if you lose out on that possible momentum from a strong early game economy, it could nevertheless serve to seriously damper your odds of winning the game, and in any case, definitely force you to face all the more uphill a struggle than you otherwise would. Definitely something to keep in mind when you're picking which planet to commit your Gravid Turvagon to is that you'll want to include in your deck a host of different Tyranid effects that allow you to put those so critically important infestation tokens into play, just because as much as possible you're going to want to derive the utmost maximum potential from this reaction as many rounds as you possibly can. So, for that reason, a good initial means of infestation might be the Scything Hormigaunt army unit, which, upon deploying that unit, allows you to pick and choose a planet at which you've deployed that unit to infest. Or, if you're okay with waiting until the combat phase, you might instead opt to use the Virulent Spore Sacs army unit, which itself has an alternative means of putting infestation tokens into play through the merit of its sacrificing itself to deal 1 damage to any present enemy army units and leave behind an infestation token as it makes its way to your discard pile. And, of course, once you happen to have at least 1 infestation token in play, you could certainly choose to take full advantage of the predation event in order to add an additional infestation token adjacent to any single planet which already happens to have 1 of those tokens in play. And so long as you can manage to prevent your opponent from winning battles at any of those planets where you happen to possess infestation tokens, it's nevertheless entirely possible that you could benefit from the utmost of this Turvagon's ability round after round. But, as can be said for both our second unveiled Tyranid Warlord and Synapse unit, it's definitely going to be extraordinarily important that you figure out exactly how you plan to keep them alive and well for as long as possible. And the same too can be said about those extraordinarily fragile Termagant tokens, just because for all the potentially respectable offensive strength that they could ultimately conjure up, if your opponent's simply able to obliterate or annihilate them through the likes of area effect or any global source of damage, then a carefully designed and Termagant synergistic deck could nevertheless ultimately prove to absolutely fall apart if your opponent can destroy some of the linchpins and enablers of that potentially potent synergy. So, for that reason, it's definitely worth considering various Tyranid cards, such as the Hunter Gargoyles army unit, that can use a combat action to shift location to any given infested planet in order to donate a couple points of attack value and 1 additional body on the battlefield for you to use to potentially protect your Synapse unit or Warlord, or in any case, possibly pick off some of your opponent's more fragile or valuable units. And although they too aren't necessarily bringing forth a tremendous amount of attack strength, through strength of numbers, they nevertheless might be another convenient means for the Tyranid player to ultimately accomplish whatever it is that you're looking to achieve. And again, so long as you possess infested planets, have a little bit of foresight, and don't mind planning ahead, you could alternatively choose to employ Spore Burst in order to potentially return an up to 3-cost Tyranid army unit from your discard pile into play at any planet where you happen to have an infestation token. So even though you have to do that in advance of any Warlord or Synapse unit being committed to that planet, you nevertheless could potentially benefit from putting yet another Tyranid army unit into play at that planet in preparation for combat, and potentially winning you all the more cards and resources during the command phase as a bit of an added bonus. So, as long as you feel relatively confident and capable of keeping the Swarmlord and or Gravid Tervigon alive, so that they can put as many Termagant tokens into play as possible, round after round, it is entirely likely that over the course of the game, you might not only be able to absolutely flood the battlefield with tokens, but, as will serve to become abundantly clear as we cover the rest of this article, it's entirely possible for you to turn them into formidable attacking units indeed. And considering just how effortless it can at times seem in order to replenish their continually depleting and dwindling numbers, given that units oh so fragile as those tokens are nevertheless quite likely to be dispatched and destroyed here and there, if not en masse, so long as you're able to keep one or either of these units in play, and to commit them to the most favorable planetary positions possible, you could nevertheless see enormous strength stemming from either one or both of these units together. But, just as I mentioned earlier, in this article we see several means for the Tyranid player to transform those relatively insignificant and unthreatening Termagant 1-attack, 1-hit point tokens into what could ultimately amount to be a formidable and daunting adversary nevertheless. And the very first of these happens to be the Swarmlord's signature army unit, of which he receives 4 copies. It's the 2-cost Brood Warriors, with a single command icon, an attack value of 2, 2 hit points, and the Creature and Leviathan traits. They have the Hive Mind specialization, which reads, each Termagant token you control at this planet gains 1 command icon. So, beyond this Tyranid warrior's relatively respectable, albeit vanilla, statistical allotment, it nevertheless does possess what could amount to be a fantastically powerful ability, in that each and every Termagant token that happens to be present at its planet does gain the benefit of 1 additional command icon, up from 0, but it's definitely worth considering that if you have multiple copies of the Brood Warriors deployed at the same planet, that effect is indeed additive. So with 2 copies of Brood Warriors, each and every Termagant token serves to gain 2 command icons. And if you combine the effects of this army unit with that of the Gravid Tervigon, particularly if that planet happens to be infested, and all the more so if the Swarmlord is being committed to an adjacent planet, the number of Termagant tokens you might see generated and spawned during that round could potentially be enormous. Even if you happen to have but a single copy of a well and cleverly deployed Brood Warriors, it's entirely possible that you might gain the benefit of an additional 3 Termagant tokens entering into play at its location during that command phase. And if each and every one of those tokens is gaining an additional command icon, your ability to surpass and absolutely overwhelm whatever command presence your opponent might hope to bring to bear against you could be absolutely astounding, in that this Brood Warrior itself not only has a command icon, each and every one of those Termagant tokens also has a command icon, but that Gravid Tervigon happens to possess a command icon as well. And unless your opponent happens to have something along the lines of an Iron Hands Tech Marine deployed at that planet, it's entirely possible that you might absolutely blow your opponent away in a command icon possessing sense. So, even though the statistical distribution of these Brood Warriors may not seem particularly respectable in and of itself, it is nevertheless entirely possible that its effective command icon value could go far above and beyond the 2 resources for 2 command icons that so many players really like to see on command phase powerful units such as the Incubus Warrior or Sanction Psyker. And, although it's definitely worth considering that any Hive Mind army unit is definitely going to be painted out as a priority target for your opponent, seeing as how it's relatively unlikely, outside of something like Exterminatus, that your opponent might destroy this prior to the resolution of the command phase, it's nevertheless entirely possible that you might ultimately benefit from this effect at least once. And seeing as how this card ultimately amasses to an investment of 2 resources and a single card, it is possible that you can, at least, make back most of its value by winning a command struggle. And of course, it goes without saying that each and every command struggle you win, or at the very least simply serve to break even, you ultimately deprive your opponent of those same cards and resources. And I think it's definitely worth considering that even if you happen to be running up against the likes of an Eldar player that happens to be very free with their committing Eldorath Starbane to the same location as some of your command icon heavy army units, seeing as how those bonus command icons are distributed across multiple units, there's no single command icon heavy unit for Eldorath to exhaust. And the same thing goes with the event superiority, in that these distributed icons aren't isolated in a sense where it's absolutely trivial for your opponent to negate your command presence. If you have 4 total command icons, but they're distributed between 4 or more different units, then your opponent being able to invest a card and resource in being able to shave no more than a single command icon off of your total all of a sudden seems absolutely insignificant. Last but not least, I'll just mention that we've previously been spoiled the army unit Toxic Venomthrope, which itself is a 2-cost, 2-command icon unit that serves as yet another means of infesting planets, and seeing as how that's a formidable command phase unit in and of itself, it's entirely likely that you'll want to deploy that to a different planet than your Brood Warriors in order to win as many command struggles as possible, or if there start to be scarcely few planets left on the board, or you're simply trying to get infestation tokens into play under any circumstances possible, then any number of these different effects taken all together could ultimately prove to be fairly synergistic, in that if you can guarantee that you're winning command through combining the Venomthrope and these warriors, then you could nearly guarantee your ability to ultimately infest a planet, and, through your Gravid Tervigon, serve to generate all the more Termagant tokens than you may otherwise do. Or, if it just so happens that that planet is indeed already infested, your Tervigon is pumping out as many Termagants as possible, and those Brood Warriors are potentially causing that 0 base command icon value to absolutely skyrocket, then you could simply serve to derive the additional alternative benefit of having those Venomthropes generate you additional cards or resources. So, certainly a tremendous tremendous amount of synergy thus far inherent to the Tyranid faction, and as will become only more and more clear, whether you're wanting to make the utmost use of these Termagant tokens through employment of the Swarm Lord, or if you're simply seeking to supplement the hard-hitting and exceptionally resilient old One-Eye with myriad token units, the options afforded to a Tyranid player without knowing the entire contents of the Great Devourer box set seem, at the moment, absolutely enormous. So, if the newly spoiled Tyranid cards we've yet covered don't already provide a compelling enough reason for you to want to opt to include any of these Termagant token spawning units in your deck, it's also worth considering that we've already seen a 3-cost army unit called the Termagant Spikers, which, though they themselves are a 1-attack value 3 hit point ranged units, they too possess the Hive Mind specialization, but instead of conferring command icons to Termagant tokens present at their planet, they instead serve to dole out the ranged keyword. So even though those tokens happen to remain just as frail and fragile as they ever were, it's nevertheless all the more likely that you'll be able to benefit from some of that attack value, potentially prior to your opponent having any opportunity whatsoever to attack them in return. And, considering just how many Termagant tokens you can potentially fill the battlefield with, being able to give 3 or more of these tokens ranged in a single round, even with but a single point for their attack value, could nevertheless prove to be significant. And seeing as how it's 3 different incoming sources of damage, should they choose to attack the same or different targets, your opponent feels all the more pressure to spend multiple instead of one large or high value shield card in order to negate as much of that damage as possible. And before I cover the Swarm Lord's signature support, which serves to return some of these Hive Mind specialization army units to play upon their destruction, we might as well cover yet another newly spoiled Tyranid army unit, the Strangler Brood, with, for the cost of a mere resource token, weighs in with a relatively paltry statistical distribution of a single point for its attack value, but with a pool of a not entirely insignificant 2 hit points. It has the Creature and Leviathan traits, and again, it happens to possess the Hive Mind specialization. And quite interestingly and compellingly, its text box reads, each Termagant token you control at this planet gets +1 attack. So, albeit entirely subject to the same restrictions as each and every other Hive Mind specialization unit, in that only Termagant tokens present at that planet happen to derive any benefit whatsoever, a potentially stacking +1 attack bonus to any number of Termagant tokens could potentially be absolutely devastating. And if you're stacking this effect with a Termagant Spikers army unit, you could potentially absolutely devastate, decimate, annihilate, and obliterate any opposition that dares stand against you. Seeing as how you could have at most 3 copies of this army unit on the table deployed at the same planet, although you're definitely starting to place all your eggs in one basket at that point, combined with the likes of a Termagant Spiker, it's entirely possible that you could get in any number of 4 attack value ranged attacks prior to your opponent being able to respond. Or, even if you don't happen to give them range, simply by merit of your being able to potentially flood the battlefield with a host and seemingly endless swarm of tokens, the amount of damage you could dish out could be enormous and in any case overwhelming. Whether you have shield cards to prevent your opponent from picking off your tokens one at a time, whether you have effects to remove some of their area effect and most frustrating, dangerous enemy army units from any given combat, whatever means you choose to use to protect your Termagant tokens and Hive Mind specialty units, so long as you are indeed able to do so, the synergy available to you through these card combos could be absolutely fantastic fun and put to enormous and fantastic use. The obvious downside to all of this is that it involves stacking a hell of a lot of army and token units on one planet, and therefore any and all of these cards become enormously susceptible to not just area effect, but also the likes of things such as Warp Storm and, as I mentioned earlier, a gleeful Plague Beast, particularly when deployed at a planet alongside Zarather, could very well serve to be the utter bane of a Swarmlord playing Tyranid player's existence. And even the 4 hit point value Gravid Tervigon isn't in and of itself tremendously hardy, so while it seems as though any and all of these effects certainly have the potential to be formidable, respectable, and powerful, it nevertheless could ultimately prove trivial if you deploy things carelessly or thoughtfully for an opponent with even the barest modicum of intelligence to absolutely pick your deck apart, tear down your linchpins, and destroy those individual army units that happen to turn your otherwise somewhat insignificant Termagant tokens into what ultimately could amount to be an nearly insurmountable presence on any number of different planets or in any number of battles. So, while I think it's nice that the Strangler Brood, and all the more the Termagant Spikers, can't be dispatched as simply as through your opponent opting to trigger a single area effect 1 volley, they nevertheless are exceptionally fragile, and I'm very curious to see, indeed, just how many different means of preserving the lives of these units, or potentially returning them to play, the Tyranid player ultimately ends up with once we see the full contents of our first box set. So, definitely worth considering that during the deployment phase, you could return one of these units to play through the likes of a Spore Burst, but considering the relatively paltry resource requirement of only 1 token, unless you have a hell of a lot of Termagant tokens at that planet, or the initiative token, or benefit from that Hive Mind specialization granting all of them the ranged keyword, it nevertheless seems absolutely trivial for your opponent to destroy a single 2 hit point army unit, and once this unit ends up in your discard pile, suddenly your up to 10 Termagant tokens seem not so threatening, and if your opponent can deprive you of up to 10 attack value through destroying but a single army unit, given just how fragile the Strangler Brood and any number of other Hive Mind specialization units are, I can't help but feel pretty hesitant and dubious about the Swarmlord's prospects as a warlord, but certainly time will tell, and if you can deploy these under favorable conditions, opportunistically and in a very clever sense, the potential inherent to so many of these cards is nevertheless enormous, and although it might be rather difficult to ultimately master the Swarmlord and Tyranid faction indeed, I'm very curious to ultimately see what a masterful Tyranid player can accomplish during any given game or tournament. But I did happen to allude to one means that the Tyranid player can use in order to return destroyed Hive Mind specialization units to play, and that is the Swarmlord's signature support, a 1-copy card, the 3-cost Leviathan Hive Ship, with the upgrade trait and reaction. After a unit you control with the Hive Mind specialization and printed cost 3 or lower is destroyed, exhaust this support to put that unit into play from your discard pile exhausted at at a planet. So it's definitely worth considering that that is by no means an insignificant investment of resources, but critically important to keep in mind is that it allows you to put that unit, upon its destruction, back into play at any planet you so choose. So you could immediately return it to the battle during which it was destroyed, or you could simply plan ahead by opting to place it at a different planet where you're ultimately going to fight a future, subsequent battle. Or, if you're simply looking to keep that unit safe, alive, and well, you could alternatively opt to put it at a planet where no battle is going to take place at all, so that you can potentially set up for a future round in order to deploy potentially as many hive mind specialization units as possible and accrue as many Termagant tokens as you can at that location to make it all but certain that eventually you're going to win some potentially decisive and pivotal future fight. Plus, although it's definitely worth noting that the resurrected unit re-enters play in an entirely exhausted and unready state, so long as it does nevertheless survive until the end of that combat round upon re-entering play, it is entirely possible that potentially you could derive the additional benefit of possibly launching additional attacks from that unit. But whether or not that does happen to be the case, I think at least from what we've seen so far, it's going to be critically important to keep those army units in play just so you can benefit from their hive mind abilities, in that being able to confer one beneficial effect to anywhere between 1 to 10 Termagant tokens seems all the more valuable than any single individual army unit having some formidable ability itself. Plus, I think it's definitely worth considering that by no means does this seem to be a cheap or inexpensive support, seeing as how you can trigger this essentially once per round, seeing as how this support does need to exhaust each and every time you choose to trigger that reaction. It could relatively quickly pay for itself, particularly if you're making the absolute utmost use of it each and every round of the game by potentially returning to play something like the 3-cost Termagant Spikers. So, over the course of a full game, if you do happen to deploy this early, the resource savings potentially afforded to you by this support could be absolutely enormous. Or if it just so happens that it doesn't seem likely that you need to benefit from this anytime soon, perhaps if you haven't drawn any of your hive mind specialization units, or you're simply not expecting any nasty surprises from your opponent, you can wait to deploy this until the turn you likely need it the absolute most. And, considering that you can trigger this reaction during any phase, and that it can affect any hive mind specialization unit, so long as it doesn't ultimately cost 4 or more resources, you could benefit from this during any given phase of the game. So, even if your opponent opts to use an Exterminatus to destroy your command icon enhancing Brood Warriors, you could simply immediately return them to play, and then, during the command phase, depending on where you commit the Swarm Lord and or Gravid Tervigon, you could generate Termagant tokens that, during that deploy phase, did not exist at all to be destroyed, and at that point, still serve to benefit from that additional command icon. So, I definitely think that the Leviathan Hive ship could potentially be critically important if you're choosing to make a hive mind specialization deck, and albeit somewhat alarmingly expensive, I think it nevertheless could ultimately serve as a bit of a linchpin in any Termagant token intensive Tyranid deck. And if you didn't already have enough means of generating as many Termagant tokens as possible, up next we also have spoiled the Swarmlord's signature attachment, which, for a cost of 1, is the unique Bone Sabers, with 3 shield icons, the same as we've seen for each and every signature attachment, as well as the war gear and biomorph traits. It reads, attached to your warlord, attached unit gets +1 attack, which serves to bring the Swarmlord up to an entirely respectable 3. And reaction. After attached unit destroys an army unit by an attack, put 1 Termagant token into play at this planet. So, definitely worth considering for this attachment is that it does, at the very least, provide a marginal attack boost for your warlord upon each and every attack he happens to leverage against whatever he happens to be fighting. But, although that reaction does strike me as potentially appealing in that for each and every combat round, each time your warlord has an opportunity to attack, you could very well ultimately destroy an army unit and serve to generate an additional Termagant token, you nevertheless cannot trigger this reaction if you happen to either bloody a warlord with his attack, or if you happen to destroy an enemy token unit. But, nevertheless, you can trigger that reaction any number of different times during any given game round. So, the longer a combat persists, the more army units your warlord destroys, ultimately the more tokens you're going to put into play. Really, the major downfall about this card is that the value of those tokens starts off small, and unless you have a large number of Hive Mind specialization units, specifically the Strangler Brood, they aren't really deriving any additional benefit from that Hive Mind specialization. If they happen to gain the ranged keyword, that doesn't provide them any benefit at all, seeing as how by the time your warlord has any opportunity to attack, the ranged skirmish is long gone. And gaining additional command icons, so far as we know now, as they would from the presence of a Brood Warriors, provides no combat benefit whatsoever. So, as with so many of these Termagant token-focused Tyranid cards, unfortunately it seems that though the potential is great, there are nevertheless quite a few possible pitfalls and downsides to this effect, and as a result, I could easily see a Tyranid player simply opting to instead use this for its 3 shield icon value to preserve the 6 hit point pool of their relatively fragile Swarmlord. And plus, it's definitely worth considering that seeing as how your opponent will be well aware of your having this attached to your warlord, they might simply save any and all shield cards to interject between your warlord's attack and whatever army unit happens to be his target, so that if they can prevent you from ultimately destroying units, then they're disallowing you from generating additional Termagant tokens during the combat phase. And although the benefit from getting in an additional point of attack or more from any of these newly generated, newly spawned Termagant tokens could be quite beneficial, if your opponent has some simple answer or solution to them, something along the lines of Area Effect 1 or 2 or a Warp Storm or whatever it happens to be, those tokens, even if you are able to ultimately generate a large number of them, could very well potentially serve you no additional benefit at all. And certainly in this situation, but as can also be said in any circumstance in which you're fighting with a large number of token units, if it just so happens that you're running up against the likes of a Captain Cato Sicarius, each and every Termagant token unit destroyed ultimately amounts to 1 additional resource for that formidable Space Marine warlord, so long as he happens to be present at that planet. So, definitely something to be aware of if you just so happen to be running up against that warlord, and certainly in that case, if you've chosen the Swarmlord as your chosen Tyranid warlord, that could definitely prove to be one hell of an uphill battle indeed. But my fellow prospective Tyranid players, you need not entirely lose yourselves to despair, for we've yet to cover the Swarm Lord's signature event, the 2-cost Indescribable Horror, of which he receives 2 copies and has a single shield icon. It has the tactic trait and reads Combat Action. Rout a target army unit with printed cost equal to or lower than the number of Tyranid units you control at that planet. And it definitely goes without saying that if your greatest fears stem from some potentially overwhelmingly powerful enemy army unit leveraging area effect against you, with the potential of annihilating your swarms and hordes of Tyranid tokens, then this Tyranid version of Archon's Terror could be an absolutely fantastic response to that unit. And definitely worth considering is that it does not specify that it has to be a non-unique unit. And, considering that you're likely to have a tremendous number of Termagant tokens in play at any given planet which you want to preserve your hordes and swarms the most, being able to meet or exceed the printed cost of whichever army unit you wish to rout could ultimately serve to be an entirely trivial affair. But, nevertheless, it is definitely worth considering that certain area effect army units are indeed rather expensive. Things like the Daring Assault Squad at 4, or the Sakea XV-88 Tau Elite Army Unit that happens to weigh in at an impressive 6 resource cost. It is entirely possible that you might not be able to meet or pass that requirement. But considering that your Warlord, Synapse units, Token units, and Army units all count toward your Tyranid unit total, it is entirely possible, if not presumably likely, that you can indeed meet the printed requirement of this event. And even if it just so happens to come down to some desperate and dire situation, in the absolute most dire of circumstances, you can, nevertheless, ultimately choose to expend this event for its 1-icon shield card value. But certainly you're not simply limited to routing area effect units. It could be any unit whatsoever that happens to be problematic for you in that specific situation. It could be an enemy Armorbane unit, whether through the likes of An-Shi, or if it happens to have printed Armorbane, such as the likes of an Iyanden Wraithguard, or it could be some daunting and formidable, hard-hitting, durable elite unit. Although, if it happens to be something along the lines of an Ultramarines Dreadnought, in most cases, unless you happen to have your Warlord or a Synapse unit present and entirely vulnerable to that potentially devastating attack value of 8, the sheer volume of outgoing Termagant token attacks could easily and readily annihilate something like that Dreadnought, just because an enormous, albeit respectable attack value of 8 is absolutely going to waste in destroying no more than a 1 hit point Termagant token each and every attack and round of combat. And, seeing as how whatever unit you ultimately choose to rout is ultimately going to be returned to the battlefield during the next round's command phase, only to be exhausted alongside that player's Warlord, you essentially derive a 1-2 benefit from this card by effectively removing whatever dangerous army unit from not just one entire combat phase, but also effectively the first round of whatever battle it may happen to participate in during the following round's combat phase. And it's entirely worth considering that, if you happen to have units deployed at the first planet, and your opponent only has a single unit there to contest you, you could simply choose to play Indescribable Horror to rout that unit and essentially win the battle at the first planet by default. And if it happens to be something along the lines of Aatrox Prime, it could be of the absolute paramount importance that you prevent your opponent from winning a battle at that planet under almost any circumstance. So, although by no means can this event help at all to prevent any number of your units from being destroyed or discarded by the likes of a truly horrific gleeful plague beast, there nevertheless exist a myriad number of different situations where this could be absolutely pivotal and critical in your preserving your army, and in any case could easily serve as an excellent means of countering whatever clever, devious, or dastardly opposition your opponent chooses to play against you. But despite our covering the entirety of the Swarmlord signature squad, the Tyranid spoilers unleashed by this article by no means end there. And up next we have the 4-cost army unit in the Adamant Hive Guard. It has no command icons, an attack value of 2, a pool of a very respectable 5 hit points, as well as the creature and behemoth traits, and the text reaction. After a unit with the Hive Mind specialization or Termagant token at this planet is assigned damage, reassign all of that damage to this unit instead. So this definitely strikes me as a very interesting addition to the Tyranid army, in that by no means am I blown away by its statistical distribution. Note in particular that for a cost of 4, it has a relatively low attack value and absolutely no presence within the command phase whatsoever, but due to that ability it might nevertheless be of the utmost importance in any Termagant token heavy deck, in that it serves to preserve your critically important Hive Mind specialization units, and in addition, your frail, fragile, easily destroyed, and readily dispatched Termagant tokens. It's definitely very important to note that this card does not specify what the source of this damage is, so it could be from an area effect card effect, it could be through an attack, or it could be through any kind of global source of damage. So if your opponent plays a Weird Boy Maniac at a planet where you happen to have any number of different Termagant tokens, you could simply choose to take each and every single point of damage to the Hive Guard instead of those single hit point tokens, and particularly considering if you happen to have a large number of Hive Mind specialization army units present at that planet, you might ultimately, through investing 4 resources in this unit, preserve what could essentially amount to an enormous and formidable armed force. But it's definitely worth noting that in and of itself, it's certainly not a formidable combat presence. Despite that pool of 5 hit points, it definitely doesn't have any kind of overwhelming combat strength, but through the merit of being able to potentially protect any number of essentially invaluable units, for all I know, it could ultimately prove to be the absolute linchpin of a Termagant token type deck. So whether or not this ultimately proves to be a mandatory deck inclusion if you're running the likes of a Swarmlord as your chosen warlord, or whether it simply proves to be ultimately overcost, only time will tell, and until we start to see more and more contents either spoiled or eventually released from our Great Devourer box set, whether or not this Hive Guard is going to be worth anyone's time, as of yet, entirely remains to be seen. It's definitely worth considering that if you happen to be running the likes of a digestion pool that we've seen spoiled in a card fan, that if you're opting to deploy the Adamant Hive Guard to a planet where there happens to be an infestation token, you can essentially shave 2 resource tokens off of its cost requirement, but that same thing can be said for each and every Tyranid army unit, so whether or not this is ultimately worth the cost color me quite curious indeed. I like, though, that this ability can be triggered during any phase. I like that it can be used when the unit's exhausted or when it's ready, and as with any reaction, it's definitely worth remembering that it's always entirely optional. And as with so many other Tyranid units, this is entirely war gear eligible, so if you're looking to, albeit conditionally and ephemerally, boost up its printed hit point value all the more, you are entirely welcome to affix one or more copies of the Noxious Flesh Boar to this unit, so while it happens to be at an oh so critically important infested planet, it happens to gain +1 hit point and +1 attack for each and every copy of that attachment. So certainly not the most enormous effect, but certainly handy nevertheless. So I'm definitely curious to see what ultimately happens with the Adamant Hive Guard, but until we find out exactly what we have to work with, all we can do at this point is speculate and hope for the best. But regardless, nearing the end of our new Tyranid spoilers, up next we have a zero-cost event called Clogged with Corpses, with one shield icon, the tactic trait, and action. Sacrifice X Termagant units to destroy a target support card with printed cost X or lower. So, although this does not cost any resource tokens whatsoever, it nevertheless allows a Tyranid player the potentially potent, even devastating ability to pick and choose any opponent's support and destroy it outright. And seeing as how so many signature supports in particular are enormously powerful and at times serve to provide your opponent with a devastating range of abilities, being able to simply pick and choose which of those to destroy and obliterate outright could ultimately prove to be fantastic. And although this seems to have somewhat of a steep cost, and that you do, despite spending no resources, ultimately have to expend your Termagant tokens, it's definitely worth keeping in mind that this is an action not restricted to any specific phase, and for that reason it's entirely possible that you might wait until you've chosen to attack with those tokens and they're sitting there exhausted prior to your opting to sacrifice them. And although it's always worth considering that sacrifice does not count as destroy, in case Tyranids happen to see any kind of card that triggers based upon the death of a Termagant token, this nevertheless could provide you with a fantastic means to overcome some of the absolute nastiest effects your opponent could use against you. It could destroy their Omega Zero command post that could fill the board with Guardsman tokens, or it could obliterate Packmaster Kith's Chimera Den that she can opportunistically use in order to flood any planet with Chimera tokens and take your Swarm Lord, Gravid Turvagon, or any number of other valuable units entirely by surprise, potentially at the end of combat when all of your units are exhausted, and before you have any opportunity to retreat, that effect could absolutely obliterate your army. And given just how rare support destruction type effects are, I think this is a very welcome addition to the Tyranid deck indeed. It could counter and effectively rout, akin to the likes of your opponent's Catachan outpost, in depriving them all the more attack than they otherwise would have, or you could simply choose to employ this effect against the likes of a Tau faction player running on Shi that happens to have played one or more copies of the potentially devastating Ximien Orbital City, which could very well allow one or more of their units to return to your planet from their HQ in order to launch another potentially devastating Armorbane keyword attack against any of your potentially invaluable Hive Mind, Synapse, or Warlord units. And in any case, although you might balk at the prospect of sacrificing several of your Termagant tokens in order to pay for this effect, it's definitely nevertheless worth considering that, if you happen to be running the Swarmlord and Gravid Tervigon, even without the likes of that Bone Scythe's attachment, you're entirely able to put something along the lines of 4 Termagant tokens into play each and every round. And seeing as how there's a distinct hard limit of 10 as to how many of any one token unit you can possess at any given time, seeing as how you could use this during your deploy phase prior to your generating additional tokens during the command or combat phases, it's entirely possible that any Termagants you ultimately choose to sacrifice, you may ultimately serve to replenish in just a few minutes or even moments later. And plus, considering the text of our yet-to-be-covered final Tyranid spoiler, it's entirely likely that any Termagant tokens you ultimately choose to sacrifice to this effect would have been destroyed regardless. So, with that in mind, our final card unveiled in this article is the 4-cost Tyranid faction event, Consumption, with a single shield icon, the tactic trait, and deploy action. Each player must sacrifice a unit at each planet if able. So, in reading this event, it is therefore entirely likely that, if you're looking to sacrifice Termagants to fund a clogged with corpses, you can simply pick those Termagants that would have ultimately been sacrificed as part of the action elicited by Consumption. And, for as expensive as this event is, it nevertheless has enormous potential in essentially boiling down to being the Tyranid faction version of the Eldar Doom or Space Marines Exterminatus. It's very important to keep in mind that this affects each and every planet in the game, and, although unless the entire board is absolutely devoid of Tyranid units, this affects you in addition to your opponent, it's certainly worth noting that this happens to affect the first planet as well, something that certainly cannot be said for Exterminatus, so if your opponent has distributed a large number of units throughout the battlefield, perhaps those heavily laden with command icons, or if they've simply opted to design and play a very high-cost, very few in number army unit type deck, this card could ultimately serve to provide a fantastic means of punishing your enemy. Once again, it's certainly worth noting that sacrifice and destroy are entirely dissimilar concepts, in that if your opponent happens to have to sacrifice something along the lines of a big Shuta battle wagon, it does not count as destroyed, and therefore does not put any, let alone 4, Snotlings tokens into play. And similarly, the Tau Carnivore Pack does not effectively refund its controller with the 3 resources they invested in that unit, because, again, it's not being destroyed, it's being sacrificed. And if your opponent is playing an elite-heavy deck, they also miss out on any opportunity to trigger fall back. And, considering that during the deploy phase, your Warlord and hopefully still surviving Synapse unit are both alive and well in your HQ, they're entirely immune to this effect. That does happen to specify units. So, if you can manage to sacrifice nothing more than a few Termagant tokens, while all the same costing your opponent some potentially expensive and valuable army units, then despite that by no means whatsoever insignificant upfront resource investment required by this event, you could ultimately derive an enormous and fantastic value from this card. And used in the right situation, this could be absolutely fantastic, particularly considering that the Swarmlord distributes Termagant tokens onto any planets adjacent to wherever you happen to commit him to, and in addition to that, if you just so choose the Gravid Tervagon as your Synapse unit of choice, you might be adding all the more Termagant tokens to the battlefield in order to lure your opponent into distributing their armed forces across as many planets as possible. So, certainly fantastic potential to be an enormously punishing event. Whether or not it ultimately sees much use or play or benefit remains to be seen, but definitely one to watch, definitely one to keep an eye on, try out, and experiment. And as with all of our Tyranid spoilers, I'm very interested to see which other effects we happen to see that make this already interesting event all the more compelling to play and potentially even all the more powerful. Plus, I definitely think it's worth considering that if you're opting to use the Savage Warrior Prime as your Synapse unit of choice, instead of the Gravid Tervagon, seeing as how you can effectively trigger more battles during any given game round than was previously possible through that Synapse unit's ability, it's entirely likely that, in an attempt to prevent you from triggering as many different planets' battle abilities as you can, your opponent may very well be encouraged to more sparsely and evenly distribute their armed forces across any number of different planets, as opposed to concentrating them in one or two different locations. And, as a result, if you can trigger consumption and force your opponent to sacrifice even more army units than they otherwise would, you could not only get more benefit out of this card itself, but by softening up your opponent's army all the more, during that round's subsequent command and combat phases, if you've got fewer command icons and fewer combat units to run up against, it's all the more likely that your Savage Warrior Prime won't only survive, but also hopefully win battles and trigger any number of different, potentially enormously beneficial battle abilities to gain you all the more advantage in whatever sense during any stage of the game. But now that we've covered our enormous 10 Tyranid spoilers unveiled within this article, that brings this video to a close. So, once again, I'll just say thank you very much for checking out yet another one of my Conquest video productions. As always, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. Be sure to leave a comment letting me know what your own thoughts, opinions, perspectives, and analyses are on any or all of the new Tyranid faction cards announced, unveiled, and spoiled in this article. Do you think the Swarmlord is going to be an asset to the Tyranid player? Do you think that he outshines the like of Old One-Eye? Or, taken all together, do you think that the Termagant tokens and Hive Mind specialization units are entirely too vulnerable and fragile to ultimately be competitive in any kind of tournament type scene? But, in any case, thank you once again for watching. Be sure to check back soon for all the more yet to arrive upcoming content, and I'll see you again soon.